Our first keynote speaker is Thomas Schieffer, former ambassador to the United States to Japan. He held this position from 2005 to 2009 and was also ambassador to Australia from 2001 to 2005. He was honored by both countries for his achievements, including receiving the Order of the Rising Sun by the Emperor of Japan in 2013. We are grateful for his presence today. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Schieffer to the stage.
Well, thank you so much. It is such a great honor to be here today, and such a pleasure to be here at the time of the cherry blossoms. I really think that the U.S.-Japan International Exchange and Tourism entity has a great role to play in bringing us back together after this terrible pandemic and the events of the last 3 or 4 years. It is so good for all of us to be in the same room again, enjoying the fellowship of friends while getting to know each other better for the mutual benefit of both our countries. At the same time, the challenges we faced over the last few years remind us that heartache and worry can never be far behind. Recalling those occurrences can sometimes leave us sad and even despondent. For now, though, it seems as if we are finally emerging from the worst pandemic in more than 100 years, a pandemic that has disrupted the world economy and cost the lives of more than 75,000 Japanese and an astonishing 1,150,000 Americans. The brutal results of the carnage in Ukraine remind us that wars of aggression are still possible in the 21st century, just as they were prevalent in the 20th. Since the outbreak of that war, it can be credibly argued that the United States and Russia have been closer to a nuclear exchange than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. Pandemics and wars are not the only things we've been dealing with in recent years. Climate change manifests itself almost daily in every typhoon, hurricane, tornado, wildfire, drought, flood, snowstorm, ice storm, windstorm seems worse than the last. More and more violence seems to grip our world, whether it is occurring in the streets and in the schools of America, the campaign trail of Japan, the churches, synagogues, and mosques of the world, or the civil wars of Africa and the Middle East. It is making all of us feel more vulnerable. Evidence of continued racial and religious discrimination in the United States haunted us throughout the pandemic. Whether it was the color of our skins or the tenets of our religion, or the justice of our causes, we ask ourselves more than once if the march of humanity was advancing or retreating. Wealth inequality accelerated during the pandemic with more of our citizens, particularly those in rural areas of the United States and Japan, feeling left behind in places with less access to the digital world, shrinking job opportunities, and out-of-date work skills. After the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, democracy seemed to bloom all over the world, in Europe in particular. Germany was reunited for the first time since 1945. Nations of the former Soviet Eastern Bloc had largely peaceful revolutions that installed democratic governments in their wake. Democracy appeared to be in the ascendance all over the world. By the time of the pandemic, however, authoritarians, as is often the case in difficult times, began to argue that democracy could no longer deliver when it came to governing. It seemed as if toxins of another virus, extremism, polarization, violence were infecting the body politic of both of our nations. Along with millions of others around the world, Americans watched in horror as hooligans bent on destruction stormed our nation's capital to prevent the peaceful transfer of power from one administration to another. That had never happened in the 245 years of American independence before that day. It was disheartening to most Americans and citizens of the world. These tragedies have been exhausting even to the most optimistic of us. Combined with the never-ending acceleration of technology and the inevitable dislocation that follows, it is no wonder that so many of our fellow citizens fear the future rather than embracing the opportunities it might present. How do we deal then with the various crises we are facing? The same way those who came before us did, by bringing good men and good women together in a spirit of cooperation and tolerance. When we listen and learn from one another, we begin to match solutions with challenges. We spark innovation, creativity, and self-confidence, rather than disappointment, despair, and disgust. That is the heart of what this symposium hopes to be, a place where dreams can begin to take the shape of realities. As we meet today, both Japanese and Americans worry that they will wake up one morning and their job will be gone. Sometimes they will be told that it is the result of a bad free trade agreement negotiated by a prior government or administration. Less often do they realize that their old job just no longer exists as a result of advances in technology. There are any number of turning pages is sometimes a technological challenge. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Think for a moment about the trip you take to an airport to catch a flight today. There is no attendant at the booth to take your toll as there had been in the past. If you leave your car for the return flight, there is no one to pay your parking. Those jobs and their functions are now performed electronically with a toll tag or a connection to your phone. When you pull up to the curb, there is seldom, if ever, a person there to help you with your luggage. Usually that occurs because you don't need as much help as you used to in the past. There are wheels on your luggage, and it's easier to manage without assistance. When you enter the terminal, there are not so many people behind the counter as there used to be. There are any number of self-check-in terminals, however, and by now you have not seen dozens of people who used to work at the airport. But when you retrace your steps, you realize you have seen some new faces too. The Uber or Lyft driver that took you to the airport, the food servers who now work at all the new restaurants that exist at the airport, and of course, there are all those security people that have been there ever since 9/11. We could go on and on about the continuous loss of jobs to technology, but we should also acknowledge that technology and innovation are continually creating new jobs that no one had ever imagined before. Jobs that none of us could imagine when we were growing up. After all, when I was growing up, Dick Tracy, who appeared in my era's newspaper comics, was the only one who could talk into a phone on his wristwatch. I also don't remember any of the kids in the neighborhood who wanted to grow up to be a social influencer or a podcast producer or a professional e-sport player. For those younger ones among us who might need further explanation, newspapers were something we used to read every day before Mark Zuckerberg started wearing hoodies. What I have just described is not new in the history of our countries. It has been going on as long as we have existed. And permit me to offer a couple of examples. The first decennial census described by our newly ratified U.S. Constitution occurred in 1790. It counted about 4 million male citizens. No one else could be a citizen at that point in time. Women, children, and the enslaved. 90% of the people that were of that census, of the people that registered, lived on farms. 90%. Clearly, the United States was primarily a rural agricultural country when it began in the 18th century. By the time the 19th century turned into the 20th in 1900, only 41% of Americans were still living on farms, but that was still the largest occupation that any existed in the United States. Even more dramatically, when the 20th century turned into the 21st century, only 1.7 Americans lived on farms and ranches. Today, less than 1%, 0.7%, live on farms and ranches. So where did all the jobs go? Did a free trade agreement cause them to go away? Were they shipped overseas because some trade agreement was made? Did Americans stop eating? Of course not. Americans left the farms and ranches of prior years for the new jobs and opportunities that technology created in the cities they then began to call home. Maybe they built farm machinery or picked up pickup trucks for the farms they or an ancestor had left, but nobody hoed cotton anymore. We also know that as a result of their migration, their economic condition improved. Since the Japan International Transport and Tourism Institute is a sponsor of this symposium, I want to tell a transport and tourism story that is a personal favorite of mine. There is a wonderful book on trade authored by William Bernstein called A Splendid Exchange: How Trade Shaped the World. In it, the author introduces us to the international ice trade business, which surprisingly began sometime in the early 1800s. It was the brainchild of an eccentric youth who was visiting a very hot Havana one summer when he had an epiphany. He could make his fortune by introducing cold drinks to Cuba. And he did it by harvesting ice from the frozen rivers of New England in the winter, packing it in the holds of ships with sawdust, and sailing south into the Caribbean and on to New Orleans, where Tudor's ice made the city's mint juleps famous. Tudor discovered that if ice blocks were large and could be fit together before being packed into the sawdust of the hold of the ship, they could be transported for large distances, and they could arrive with 2/3 or more of the ice they left from in the port of Boston. He was greatly aided by a hotel keeper, Nathaniel Wythe, who patented a horse-drawn innovation that included saws that could cut 20-inch blocks of ice out of rivers. It could then be stacked tightly into ships. Tudor expanded his trade to Europe and the west coast of the United States. In September of 1833, Tudor's American clipper Tuscany arrived in Calcutta with more than 100 tons of crystal clear New England ice. Keep in mind that was before there was a Panama Canal, so the Tuscany had to cross the equator twice before it arrived in India. By 1850, the international ice trade had become a stunning success. By tonnage, ice had become the largest product exported from Boston Harbor. Around the same time, a New England meat packer named Gustavus Swift moved his company to Chicago to be near that city's railhead hub. Swift knew that the less you moved live cattle on rail cars, the less weight they would lose before they got to market, and the less stress they would endure that would toughen their meat in the process. But the railroads in Chicago had no interest in designing cars that would chill already butchered beef as Swift designed his own. So Swift designed his own. Philip Armour, another meat packer, added a cooling mixture of crushed ice and salt that made the rail cars even better. Frederick Tudor's ice trade to India crashed when Calcutta opened its first artificial ice plant in 1878, 50 years after it had begun. The new technology meant it was no longer necessary to bring ice from New England to cool the drinks of Indians and Englishmen in Calcutta. While Tudor had never been interested in making artificial ice, he only wanted to sell the kind that nature made, Swift and Armour had a different opinion. To them, artificial refrigeration was only a means to their end of getting fresher, more tender beef to their customers. They embraced it wholeheartedly. Both opened meat packing plants in my hometown of Fort Worth, Texas, the leading railhead of Texas at the time. For decades, those plants were a major source of income and growth for the city until the technology of meat packing changed again when the concept of large rural feedlots was introduced. Armour closed the last meatpacking plant in 1971, leaving Fort Worth with only its history and a lot of vacant land downwind from the old stockyards. So what is happening in that part of Fort Worth today? I'll give you a hint. Every day at 3 p.m., you can see a herd of longhorn cattle driven through the streets of the stockyards. You can take pictures with the herd, the cowboys who drive them, or can go have a drink on one of the bar stools that's shaped like a Western saddle. When the drive is over, you can buy any kind of cowboy hat, pair of boots, shirts, or Western wear of any quality you might want from the myriad of retail stores that are in the area. When you're tired of shopping, you can rest a bit on and have a drink. After drinks, enjoy a steak at restaurants like the Cattleman's, my favorite, which was founded in 1947. Then it is off to Billy Bob's, which advertises itself as the world's largest honky-tonk, where you can watch real cowboys ride real bulls indoors or dance the night away while listening to the biggest stars of country western music perform. What happened to the vacant land that was downwind from the noxious odors of the Fort Worth stockyards? A developer named Rossborough Jr. bought 27,000 acres of it, built an industrial airport that attracted dozens of Fortune 500 company offices. The Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad made it their national headquarters. Now every day, 365 days a year, a dozen or more container trains arrive from Long Beach, California. They have offloaded all the things that are coming out of Asia, and they head to Fort Worth, and there at the end, all the merchandise from all over Asia is downloaded and appears throughout Texas, the Midwest, and the South. In addition to the commercial business, thousands of single-family homes and multifamily apartments have also been built in Perot's Alliance project. All that activity has fueled the growth that has now made Fort Worth the 12th largest city in America, with the fastest growing growth rate of any American city with a population of over 500,000. In 2026, Fort Worth will welcome its 1 millionth resident to the city. Fort Worth is a pretty good story that can trace its roots to transport, river ice, refrigeration, cattle drives, stockyards, meatpacking, railroads, airports, redevelopment, and tourism. I tell these stories because they remind us that as bad as the recent past has been, opportunities sometimes come to us disguised as challenges. There is no doubt that we face serious challenges in the years ahead. The world is a dangerous place right now, but I am confident that we still have the ability to prevail over adversity. The war in Ukraine will be over one day, and Vladimir Putin will not have achieved many, if any, of his original goals. Ukraine will not be part of a new Russian empire. NATO, which he hoped to weaken or at least make irrelevant, is stronger today than ever before. Putin hoped to demonstrate with his war that Europe was dependent on Russian oil and gas and would have to bend to his will to survive a cold winter. Instead, Europe has shown that it will never again put its freedom at risk by depending on an autocratic regime like Putin's to meet its energy needs. And finally, Putin had hoped to demonstrate to the world that America was in decline and incapable of leading the international order. Instead, the United States has shown the value of having alliances that can stick together and thwart the aggression of bad actors. If there is any good that could come out of Putin's war in Ukraine, it will be that it gave pause to Xi Jinping's thoughts of moving against Taiwan. It is pretty clear now that Chinese aggression will be met with a free world response that could impact the long-term ambitions of China severely. The economic challenges we face are just as important as the security challenges we face. We must be part of a global effort to transition from carbon-based energy to clean energy, or we won't have a habitable planet to leave to our descendants. Again, I am confident we still have the ability to do that. A month or so ago, I accompanied a client to Houston. Energy concerns were at the top of the client's agenda. We met with the business and political leaders of that city and region. Their message was all the same. Houston is the energy capital of the world, and they want it to stay that way. To them, energy doesn't just mean oil and gas. It is wind, solar, hydrogen, carbon sequestration, and everything else that may be coming down the road. They wanted to be at the forefront of that new technology to keep Houston as the energy capital of the world. These weren't political activists that we were talking to. They were people already involved in the oil and gas business who didn't want to repeat the mistakes of our friend Frederick Tudor, who had the idea of selling river ice with all its impurities to Cubans so they could cool their drinks. It created an international business out of his idea that made him enormously wealthy over the first 50 years that it was in operation, and then saw it all collapse because he thought his customers would never prefer artificially produced ice to the kind made by nature. We don't have to have an either-or situation with energy. Roughnecks in the oil patch don't have to lose any more than people leaving agriculture had to lose when they left the farms that had been their family's work for generations. New opportunities in energy are already popping up. New opportunities in new jobs that have never existed before are opening up. New ideas that will found new industries are occurring almost daily. People may need more education to qualify for those jobs, but we can handle that. Education has always been and always will be the ladder up for social mobility. If we will continue to expand that education, if we will continue to value its worth, we can get the job done. We are at a turning point in history today. There is much to do in many places, and we have the opportunity to do it. Hopefully, we will leave this symposium excited about our future and excited that a new day, a better day, is on the way. Thank you.